And welcome to The Bottom Line, where we dig deeper into some of the main business and economic stories of the day. Today, I want you to join TVP World's Don Arleth, who spoke to Professor Ian Begg earlier this week at the Europe Future Forum 2024. This annual conference was organised by the Visegrad Insight think tank. The interview focuses on the recently published Draghi report and the challenges faced by Europe in the realms of energy, innovation and investment.
And the Europe Future Forum by Visegrad Insight continues here, and now on TVP World I'm joined by Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Of course, thank you, sir, very much for joining us here in person. I'd like to start off with the Draghi report, which essentially says 5% of European GDP needs to be reinvested or invested into its own economy, and of course sparking innovation on the European continent. Is this a pipe dream? Is this a hard dose of reality? What are your thoughts?
It's a pipe dream, which is a hard dose of reality, both at once, because it's certainly the case that investment levels across Europe are not only lower than they used to be, but certainly lower than global competitors, particularly China. And that means if you want to maintain your competitive position, and after all, his report is on competitiveness, you need to invest more. But the reason I say it's also a pipe dream is it's not obvious what the mechanism is to raise that investment rate. It relies on governments trying to do a bit more with public investment, but it mainly relies on the private sector. And if the private sector doesn't see opportunities, getting that investment higher, even if you throw in new incentives for tax write-offs or other things, is going to be reluctant to do it. Also, investment can be distorted if it goes in areas which are not growth related. I'll give you one example of this. In the early 2000s, Spain was investing more than 30% of GDP, but a large proportion of that was going on housing. Now, housing is fine, we all want houses, but it doesn't promote the growth of the economy on a sustainable basis. And therefore, the difficulty in this is finding the mechanism that's going to induce more investment to happen.
In areas of innovation for Europe, where do you think it's lagging, and where do you think that the direction needs to be headed? It's just my general perception that Europeans generally think that the Green Deal and all the investments in green technology is going to somehow save the European continent.
Well, it's hard to say that the green approach has saved the European continent. What it has done is to open up a new channel for investment, which is investing in alternative energy sources. That is desirable, both from a climate change perspective, but also from an energy security perspective, because it means, let's face it, less reliance on Russian gas and less reliance on gas from other unstable parts of the world like the Gulf. So there is a long-term desirability about the green approach, particularly in the energy sector. However, it's going to take quite a long time, and the interim is going to be a higher cost. And this has a negative repercussion for competitiveness, because the higher cost is one of the things that's been damaging to German industry and that in other manufacturing intensive countries.
So what areas do you think need to be focused on to make the European economy more resilient and more innovative?
Well, Draghi's report is 400 pages, but he mentions some very obvious things, such as that there are far too few European companies in the next area of technology. I think he says that there are something of the order of 3 or 4 technology companies in the top 50 globally. I remember looking for a paper I wrote at the number in AI, and it was 0 in the top 50. With these sorts of figures, you're lagging behind Silicon Valley, you're lagging behind China, you're lagging behind Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And if Europe wants to prosper, it needs to change its approach to the innovation, not just in traditional industries, where it's been quite strong, but in the industries of the future, where it needs to make an impact. Because let's face it, Europe is never going to compete on the low cost of labor. It's only going to cost on having added value in key sectors.
Now, in terms of the European Central Bank, well, it's taken unprecedented steps in recent years to stabilize the Eurozone. We've had a huge pandemic, right? And I guess the question moving forward is what is the ECB's role going to be in the future? And we have increasing defense budgets. Will that play in any way on the decision to limit national deficits and public spending?
Well, I think it's important to separate the ECB, because it's responsible for monetary policy, and the national deficit, which are the responsibility of finance ministries. The ECB will be alarmed if national deficits and national public debt go up as a proportion of GDP. And its natural caution would say it would either raise interest rates if that were to happen on a dramatic scale, or not lower them from their current levels if it feels there's a big economic risk to fiscal sustainability. The ECB's primary mandate is inflation. It sees inflation coming down, maybe not going down back to where it was 5 or 6 years ago, which was 0, but instead stabilizing at normal levels. The ECB will be looking at all this. It's concerned about the impact of climate change on the financial viability of banks. It's concerned from that point of view with the financial stability of banks. If banks are faced with bad loans or with clients who go under because of climate change, that is a monetary policy concern. But it will be leaning more on the fiscal authorities, including at European level, to do more on dealing with deficits and debts. That separation is an important one in macroeconomic policy.
And finally, as an expert on economic governance, how do you foresee the European Union navigating the economic challenges of the coming decade, particularly with inflationary pressures, post-pandemic recovery, and shifting global trade dynamics?
How long do you have? It's a very broad question, and I think that what we've seen in the last year has been the introduction of what's called the new economic governance framework at European level. It updates the approach to fiscal rules at European level, but also adds complexity to it. The expectation is that more responsibility goes from Brussels intervening to member states taking their own responsibility for their fiscal positions. They also have to emphasize growth, because it's a very simple observation. If you're looking at the debt to GDP ratio, there are two components: the debt, which we focus on, but GDP. If GDP grows and debt is the same, the debt to GDP ratio goes down. And that's what, in part, this economic governance framework is designed to do, is to bolster growth and avoid the stock of debt getting bigger. Act on both and you should have a more desirable outcome.
One more I'd like to add, and that is about Polish defense spending. It's going to be close to 5% next year, or by the end of the year. Is this a threat to the Polish national debt? Is this going to be a problem for Poland, or is this a long-term investment that should be looked at slightly different?
To begin with, Poland has fiscal room. Unlike other countries which already have big deficits and high debt, Poland's debt is below 60%, the Brussels benchmark. So that means that Poland has some scope to go up in the level of debt. However, there is a constitutional provision in Poland which says there's a limit. You can't go beyond that. Poland has room to do this, but it has to be aware that if it increases defense spending on a regular basis, something else has to give. Either taxes have to rise, or other public expenditure, and the most obvious candidate is welfare spending, has to go down. So I wouldn't envy the Polish finance minister when he has to negotiate with a defense minister who says yes, 5-6%, and he then has to tell the social welfare ministers, no, your budgets for pensions and other things have to be cut. It's trade-offs, and trade-offs are never easy in politics.
Professor Ian Begg, European Institute, London School of Economics, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Don.
And that was my colleague Don Arleth speaking to Professor Ian Begg of the Europe Institute at the London School of Economics. Thanks so much for joining us on The Bottom Line. I was your host, Marie Cato. Join us again back on Monday at 5 p.m. CET on TVP World. For more business stories, check us out on X and on tvpworld.com. Coming up next, World Talks. Goodbye.